Alrighty, everybody. A good evening to you today for our online review session for the AP Human Geography exam, which, of course, is in less than 48 hours. So, we are here with you today to answer any and all questions that you have in preparation for the exam. As a reminder, please go ahead and use the Google Doc, which is available on Schoology. So you can go ahead and check that out to see if you have any questions there. You can ask your question. You can also use the chat feature on the right hand side of your screen as well. So that is an option for you as well to be looking at. So without any further ado, we'll go ahead and get started on the couple of different questions that we have on the Google Doc, and then we'll see if anybody has any questions as we go forward. So, question number one here on our Google Doc asks, what is redlining and what are boundaries of political, what are the boundaries of political human geography? So this comes to us primarily from our political geography unit and the cities and urban land use unit as well. So redlining is a process that was done really in the 1960s in which bank lenders, banks or other lenders, would essentially um, mark on a map with red, hence why it was called redlining, areas that they were not going to lend money to. Those areas were seen as high risk lending areas, and they did not want to lend money in that area because they were not certain that they were ever going to get that money back. So they put a red line on the map. Now, historically, those areas were areas where there were more diverse ethnic neighborhoods, things like African American neighborhoods, things like Hispanic American neighborhoods. Those areas were not lent money because, so the theory went, that you would never get your money back from an investment. Now, the problem with that is that since no money was being lent in those areas, there was no ability to improve those areas. So essentially, when those areas became dilapidated, when these areas became areas that were not taken care of, when they needed to be fixed up, the money was not lent there to fix up. That led to further deterioration and further exodus from that area of the city. So when we look at the idea of redlining is a process that essentially led to the areas of the city which were more diverse, both ethnically and racially, that were not nearly as well tended. Today, it is illegal. You cannot redline today. But it was a large factor in the 1960s, and in many cases, it led to a further decline in the a further decline in the cities, and then an exodus to the suburbs in some ways as well. In terms of boundaries, this is from our political geography unit. In terms of boundaries, there are kind of two real main types of boundaries that we talked about. If you're talking about the question about antecedent, those were boundaries that were drawn before human settlement. Usually, those were boundaries that were natural features. So, before humans settled an area and made marks on the land saying this is where the land starts, this is where the land ends, that was more of a natural boundary. Hey, our boundary will go to this water source. Hey, our boundary will go to these mountains. Our boundary will go to the forest. It was drawn before human settlement, and by drawn, it wasn't really drawn on a map. It was kind of communicated. This is where the boundaries would be. The second major type of boundary is something called a subsequent boundary. And subsequent boundaries occur after human settlement. And those subsequent boundaries are boundaries that are drawn after humans have settled an area. And they essentially are drawn to mark the limits of where the political influence of a country is. Now, there's a couple different types of subsequent boundaries. The first is a boundary called a consequent boundary. A consequent boundary is a boundary that was drawn as a consequence of something. For example, uh, in the time period of post World War II India, Britain is removed from the Indian subcontinent, and what we see here is India was made up at the time of what we know today as India and the land that we know today as Pakistan. Those were both areas of British India. Well, of course, we know that today India is Hindu and Pakistan is Muslim, but that was all one country. So, what they did is they drew a boundary, and it was drawn in order to accommodate the existing differences that were there. Hence, that's a consequence. It was drawn as a consequence of the existing political differences. So, they drew a line where on one side of the line was a Hindu country known as India. On another side of the line was a Muslim country known as Pakistan. Now, the problem with drawing consequent boundaries is that not everybody in that area is the religion that you have or the ethnic group that you have. Going back to the India and Pakistan example, while the vast majority of people in Pakistan were Muslim, there were still Hindus that were there. And while the vast majority of people in India at the time were Hindu, there were still Muslims that were in India at the time. So essentially, what we see here is people are trapped behind these borders, and and the borders, which were drawn to accommodate these differences, in some ways act as a deterrent for these people being able to leave. The second type of consequent, the second type, rather, excuse me, subsequent boundary drawn after human settlement is that called a superimposed boundary. And a superimposed boundary really doesn't care about the differences in a country, in an area. So, for example, we go to we go to the African continent, and on the African continent, of course, there were peoples there for thousands of years. The Europeans came in during the during the time period of imperialism, thanks to a specific thing called the Berlin Conference. And at the Berlin Conference, the European powers divided up Africa, but they did so in such a way that never accommodated the differences. Europe and the European powers cared about one thing, and that was the resources that were available. The peoples that were in Africa at the time were then put into these country boundaries arbitrarily. So the ethnic groups that might have been enemies for centuries were now in one political boundary, not because of their choice, but because the boundary was superimposed upon them. The religious group that had years and years of conflict is now forced to be together. This is one of the problems we see in the continent of Africa today is a lot of these boundaries have not changed since this time period. So as a result, you still have these boundaries which have jumbled together all of these different ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups that never really were together, and in some cases should not be together. But that's what a superimposed boundary does. It does not accommodate for the existing differences. The final boundary is a relic boundary. A relic boundary is a boundary that used to exist in the past, but no longer exists. It may be still visible in some cases. The Berlin Wall used to accommodate the difference between East Germany and West Germany. Today, the Berlin Wall does not exist. You can see parts of the Berlin Wall, but it does not act as a border between East Germany and West Germany. The Great Wall of China is no longer a boundary that marks the limit of Chinese influence. The Chinese influence goes well beyond that boundary. So that's an example of a relic boundary, a boundary that does not exist in today's day and age. That's a good question. A lot of good information there for that. Another question asked here on the Google Drive was, what is a difference between the first and second agricultural revolution. The first agricultural revolution really was the idea of, can you farm, right? The idea of simply growing things. And of course, when we talk about this agricultural revolution, we're looking at seed agriculture and vegetative agriculture. One of these questions came up in class a couple of class periods ago. Carl Sawyer. Carl Sawyer was a gentleman who came up with this theory about how agriculture started. And this is really the first agricultural revolution, where it's the idea that you can plant seeds in the ground, and then when the conditions are right, and when they are nurtured, when they are fertilized, and when they are provided with water, they can grow. I know it sounds revolutionary, but remember, folks, this is the time of hunting and gathering where you would not live a sedentary lifestyle. The first agricultural revolution really was this sedentary lifestyle that developed at the time. In some parts of the world, like Mesopotamia, i.e., Fertile Crescent, i.e., Middle East, that's where you saw this mix with the domestication of animals. And that really was a game changer, because when you domesticated animals, then you not only had your crops, but you could have the animals do the work for you as well. And that really helps start civilization out. The other type of agricultural revolution that the first agricultural revolution deals with is the idea of vegetative planting. Vegetative planting is the idea that if you kind of cut certain crops in certain ways, they will grow. This is called essentially transplanting. Some of your parents may do this in the summer and spring months, where if your neighbor has a plant they really, really like, they'll take a little piece of it, put it in their yard, and grow it. That's vegetative planting. That also came about during this time period. The second agricultural revolution really corresponds very nicely with the industrial revolution. The idea that prior to this time period, it was the human beings that were doing the work. It was also animals as well. But the second agricultural revolution really comes up with this mechanized farming. It really comes up with this idea of using a field rotation system. So that way you're not depleting the nutrients in an area. It also looks using a little bit more fertilizer aspects of it. So the second agricultural revolution really uses a lot of the tools and the ideas of the industrial revolution to help really grow agriculture. So it's kind of amazing to think that for thousands of years, the agriculture was done the exact same way. And it was not until the middle part of the 1700s that we had the second agricultural revolution. The third agricultural revolution, of course, is something we are in right now. And this is often tied to genetically modified foods, the green revolution as well. The idea that we are able to spread. When we think of green revolution, we think of like energy independence and that type of stuff. That's not what the green revolution is in terms of agriculture. What the green revolution is in terms of agriculture is the idea that you're using high yielding crops. You're using genetically modified crops in order to produce more food for more people. Very important in today's day and age, of course, because our population is so large that we need to make sure that the people are being fed, that the people are able to be fed and sustained. So that's a great question on the agricultural revolution. The third question on here comes from the idea of the idea of thematic maps. What are the thematic maps is what we are looking for here. So what are thematic maps? So thematic maps are several different types of thematic maps. Four types of thematic maps that we talked about. The first, of course, is the isoline map. And when we talk about thematic maps, we're not talking about the map that you see every day in your Worldle, right? Where it's you're looking for a reference map, or you're looking to drive to a place and you look on the map for it. A thematic map is a map that tells a story. This goes way back to our days, the very beginning of the year, with the thematic maps telling a story. So the isoline map, an isoline map is a map that connects equal points of value. The idea behind this is that you're connecting all of the 100s, you're connecting all of the 90s, you're connecting all of the 80s, you're connecting all of the 70s, and you are creating essentially a series of contours. Now, what we see with an isoline map is the isoline map is usually done in topography, where it's looking at the elevation change of an area. When my wife and I go hiking, we look at the topography, and you never want to go hiking in an area where you see lines that are very close, because that means it goes from 70 to 80 to 90 to 100 very, very quickly. That means that's going to be a very steep incline. Instead, you want the 70 to 80 to 90 to 100. You want to spread it out more. That's the idea of an isoline map. You also see an isoline map in the weather maps. If you look at a typical weather map that looks at the highs for the countries or the lows in the country for the day, that's an isoline map, connects points of equal value. A choropleth map looks like an isoline map in that you might have colors associated with it, but where it differs is the choropleth map categorizes those colors. So, our best example here is that political map, right? If you look at a political map of the United States and you're looking for those dark red areas that are very conservative, very Republican, and those dark blue areas, those areas that are very liberal, very democratic. The darker the red, the more Republican. The darker the blue, the more Democratic. Now, that only works though if you are having an area that you are measuring. That can be a state, it can be a county, on a country level, on a worldwide level, it can be a country. But the idea here is that instead of the isoline map, which can go through boundaries, like if you look at a weather map of the United States, you're going to see lines go through Texas and go through Illinois and Virginia with different temperatures. But if you look at a map of Virginia for politics, you're only going to see one state, right? Looking at the United States, you're only going to see the Virginia as one color if you're looking at it from a state level. If you're looking at a county level, of course, you'll see the different colors based on different counties that are there. But you got to have an area to shade in. That's the idea of a choropleth map. It's a graduated color scale that we see in there. Um, the third type of map, of course, is your dot map. Your dot map, one dot equals one instance. Very hard, those dot maps to tell because it doesn't really do a great job of telling you a lot of information. It just says one instant occurs here. Now, if you're looking at a small area like a map of Springfield and you dot out all of the accidents, that's pretty helpful because you can see where those accidents occur, where there might be a need to a new stoplight or a stop sign or something along those lines. But if you have a dot map of the United States, that doesn't tell you a whole lot of information. So dot maps are usually reserved for areas that are much smaller, that you can look at what's going on in there. The final one, of course, is your proportional symbol map. Your proportional symbol map is a map that's going to be larger. The symbols will be larger based on what's occurring there. So, for example, what percent of the country or percent of the county has this job or something along those lines? Proportional symbol map you'll see there. So, those are the four major types of your thematic maps. Question number 4 here on the Google Doc refers to how do complex commodity change link production and the consumption of agriculture? So, lots going on there. Let's talk about what a complex commodity chain is, or let's talk about what a commodity chain is to begin with. My wife and I had spinach for dinner tonight. And while we await our spinach to be grown in the garden out front, we needed to get some green giant spinach. The commodity chain of the green giant spinach is the fact that there is a spinach farmer, probably in Oregon, for example, that is growing the spinach that my wife and I ate tonight. What a commodity chain is how does that farm grown spinach get in Oregon, get to my wife and I's table? That's the idea of the commodity chain. Well, you have the grower, right, who's actually growing the spinach. You may have the truck driver who takes the spinach to the Green Giant production facility. You have the Green Giant production facility worker that helps wash the spinach or sort out the spinach. Then you have the packaging of the spinach. Then you have the person who drives the spinach from one area to another, to the giant distribution center. And then you have the giant distribution center, which then moves the spinach to our local giant. That's the commodity chain. It links me as the consumer of the spinach and the spinach producer. What happens, however, is in today's day and age, that commodity chain back in the day was very easy. I either grew my own spinach or I went to my local farmer down the road. I bought my spinach from him and we were all good. In today's day and age, there are tons of people that need spinach and they have to be provided with spinach. So, as our population has grown, there's been a huge emphasis on the idea of how do we get an enormous amount of spinach into the hands of people who need spinach. And this is where the complex commodity chains come from because the spinach that I'm eating from Green Giant comes from one farmer. The spinach you eat from Green Giant might be from another farmer. So linking those farmers together to the Green Giant production plant, which then gets produced to me and you, that's where the complex commodity chain comes from. That's just for the United States. If we were to say, which happens all the time, there are farmers in Iowa that are growing corn and growing soybeans for people in China, that adds an entire another layer of the commodity chain. So when we talk about the commodity chain, we're talking about how do we link this production of food to the consumer of that food. And all those stops along the line are the commodity chain. And it's gotten much more complex in today's service based economy because while I grow my own spinach, many people don't grow their own spinach. They're too busy being engineers and being doctors and that type of stuff. We have so few farmers that we need to link those so few farmers with those many doctors and lawyers who need to eat their spinach in order to, perform well, like Popeye. Question number 5 asks, how can political power and territoriality be used as a tool by a political geographer? So, when we look at territoriality and political power, I immediately think of using your power as a political influencer to manipulate maps. And one of the things I think about a lot with this question is the idea of gerrymandering, right? We just went through our 2020 census not that long ago. And throughout the course of this year, all 50 states have been arguing about what their maps are going to look like for the next 10 years. Now, in a state like Alaska, it's easy, right? Because they have one representative. So there's no finagling of what's going on. On the other end of the spectrum, though, what gets complicated is a state like New York. New York lost population, so they are losing one seat in the House of Representatives. Well, the Democratic Party controls a lot of New York politics, so they're trying to use their political power to draw a map which limits the influence of Republicans and strengthens the power of Democrats. Much the same way, Texas went the opposite way. Texas gained seats. And even though they gained seats in areas that were more traditionally Democratic, in areas right outside the cities, in areas that were in the cities or in the suburbs of Texas, the Republicans in Texas wanted to create a map that benefited them. So they designed a map that even though you had more people living in areas that were Democratic, they tried to carve it in such a way where it benefited the Republicans. That's a great example of using territoriality to your political advantage. Happens all the time with gerrymandering. As much as we want to say that politicians will be good and have our best interest in heart, they're, of course, politicians first. And so they want to draw lines that benefit them. There are politicians out there who believe that this should be done via a computer program, that this should be drawn according to a proportion. So that way we have districts that are very equal, right? So that way there's 50% people of Republican, 50% people of Democrat. But in actuality, that's not the way it works. There's some ridiculous stat out there, don't hold me to it, that like 85% of all House of Representative seats are not competitive. Think about that. 85% of the House representatives, if they make it out of their primary, their biggest challenge is another Republican challenging them or another Democrat challenging them. It's not the other side, right? That's pretty crazy to think about how gerrymandered, how politically aligned the states are. And that's a big thing when we look at, the idea of politics. And you guys will learn about that more in government next year if you're a junior, or if you're in government this year, you learned about that this year. About there are people who say, that's one of the problems with elections, that we need to have more of this balance here so that we have not kind of the kind of ideologues on each side, but we have more kind of middle of the road people. But right now, the political parties are more concerned with keeping their power rather than making it a competitive balance. That's where we see a lot of gerrymandering in that question. Question number 6 asks, what is new urbanism? New urbanism is something that is going on currently today in the um, cities, and the idea of new urbanism is what you all see every day in Mosaic, and it's also what you all see every day in Tyson's Corner. New urbanism is this idea of creating portions of a city or an edge city that are mixed use, that traditionally the inner city, the central business district was just that. It was a central business district. It's where you went for your business purposes, right? If you were, your lawyer might be downtown there. Your doctor might be in the downtown area. Your shopping center might be in the downtown area. The problem is people would commute to that downtown area to do business, and then they would go somewhere else to live. And it really was an inefficient use of land. So now we have what's called new urbanism. And what new urbanism is it's the idea that your place where you can shop can be on the bottom street level. So that way all people can access it. But your living area, your living space is going to be on the top level. Hey, not an entire street block where there's a fancy dressmaker, there's a fancy restaurant. That area is only on the bottom level. That means you're wasting that top level. So the idea is let's have areas where people can live above that. Great example going on in DC right now down by Nats Park is that Navy Yard area that we see, or that ballpark area that area is, where you see by the sports stadium, right? You might have a Buffalo Wild Wings on the bottom, or you might have a fancy restaurant on the bottom, but then on the top are these high-rise buildings that are charging $3,000, $3,500 a month to live rent-wise in that area. So that's the idea of new urbanism. So you're creating a more efficient use, hopefully minimizing the structure of people needing to go in and out of that area, because the people who live there will not need a car to go to those areas, or can use public transportation or something along those lines. So that's the idea of new urbanism. Efficient city design is the goal behind new urbanism. The problem, though, with that, new urbanism sounds great, but a lot of the times it's because of a process of either urban renewal or gentrification that happens. And that, of course, is going to remove people that were living there for quite some time, remove them and have them live, be forced out because they can no longer afford the $3,500 rent a month that is there, when it used to only be $1,500 a month to live there. So you see that happen as well. Question number 7 here deals with what are the different types of diffusion. So there are 2 main types of diffusion that you should be aware of. The first type of diffusion is called relocation diffusion. This is the diffusion pattern that went along for much of human history. The idea is with relocation diffusion that you are literally moving, and as you move, you're bringing your culture, you're bringing ideas with you. Religion was spread via relocation diffusion by missionaries, right? Missionaries would take the word of God, spread it to other areas, and that area would then develop that religion. That's the idea of a missionary. Think the Catholic missionaries that came over during the age of colonialism. where they set up missions in Los Angeles, San Diego, San Antonio, right? That area where you saw that became predominantly Christian because people brought those ideas with them. Language is another great example of a relocation diffusion, that you take the language that you speak, you go to another area, and then people speak that language as well. Relocation diffusion is a big part of that. The second type of diffusion is something called expansion diffusion. Expansion diffusion is a diffusion that starts at a node or a hearth and then spreads from that node or hearth outwards. Good example, there are three different types of expansion diffusion. The first is hierarchical diffusion. The node in the hierarchical diffusion is usually a person, or what we would maybe call today the word influencer. Good example of an influencer or a node of power today are athletes or celebrities who endorse things. The celebrity athlete says, "This shoe is cool. This movie is cool. This song is cool." And people then, because the athlete or celebrity says it's cool, then follow it. The celebrity doesn't move to spread that information. In today's day and age, the celebrity says on their Instagram, TikTok, says, "This is what you should do," and then people follow it. But the celebrity themselves is not moving. The message is moving. Back in the day, it also could be people like kings, could be hierarchical diffusion, where they could say, "This is what you're going to do," and then people would follow it in that regards. The second type of um, the second type of expansion diffusion is contagious diffusion. Contagious diffusion is a rapid, widespread diffusion. Most people think, when we think of contagious diffusion, they think of the idea of like a cold or a flu or something like that. When we talk about contagious diffusion, we're talking about these rapid, widespread. I think of things like trends or things like fads, that all of a sudden they start somewhere, boom, and they explode rapidly from this one center point, and boom, they explode, but they also can go away pretty quickly as well. Think back a couple of years ago of your silly bands or the ice bucket challenge or the latest TikTok trend, right? The devious licks that was earlier this year that has since gone away. That's an example of contagious diffusion. The final type is the most confusing of all, and that's the stimulus diffusion. Stimulus diffusion is a diffusion related to expansion diffusion that that the underlying concept moves, but the main idea doesn't move, but perhaps an underlying concept of it does move. The hearth in this case is the original idea, where it might not move, but some of the underlying concepts do. Good example here is when you look at some foods, right? Think about McDonald's, and we use this example in class, and it's probably the best one we can think of, with the idea of McDonald's with the hamburger. The idea of McDonald's has this hamburger, this fast food hamburger. Well, in India, you can't have a hamburger because it's made from cow. India doesn't eat cow. So instead, there's the Maharaj burger, which is a lamb burger. The idea is the same. The underlying idea, a patty of ground meat, is the idea that spread from America to India. The actual hamburger did not spread, but the idea of a patty of ground meat did spread, and that's an example of stimulus diffusion. I'm going to get Mr. Lincoln here. Those are your three different types of diffusions. I'm going to get Mr. Lincoln here with what is the difference between centripetal and centrifugal forces. And this goes back to our culture and our political geography unit. A centripetal force is a force that brings a group of people together. In some parts of the world, that might be a language. It also might be a religion. If you think about, for example, in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a predominantly Muslim country, specifically Sunni Muslim country. That acts as a centripetal force. If you want to unite people in Saudi Arabia, you talk to them about religion because that's a centripetal force that brings people together. On the opposite side is a centrifugal force. A centrifugal force is a force that can break people apart. If you want to talk about breaking people apart because of religion, talk about Ireland with the idea of you have Northern Ireland, which is Protestant, and then you have the rest of Ireland, which is Catholic. If you were to talk to people in Ireland about religion, that was a centrifugal force. It was breaking people apart. They wanted to be one, but religion was breaking them apart. So, what one person's bringing of together can be another person's breaking apart. But the idea of a centrifugal force is a force that brings people together. A centrifugal force is what breaks people apart. A unifying language, a common culture, a one religion being practiced are all examples of centripetal forces. Centrifugal forces are things like multiple languages, multiple religions, multiple ethnicities in an area, which can sometimes tear people apart because people then have to decide what their loyalty is to. Is their loyalty to something higher, or is it to their own cultural attribute that they have? So that's the idea of centripetal and centrifugal. Going back to the idea here of our Google Doc, question number 8 is what is the difference between small scale and large scale? So when we look at this, was in the very beginning of our time together, the idea of large scale, small scale. This is when we look at maps and the different map scales that are available. Small scale typically means small scale, small detail. If you're looking at a small scale map, you're usually looking at a very, very large area that doesn't give you a lot of detail. For example, a map of the United States is a small scale map. It doesn't give you a lot of detail. Yeah, you might have the different shapes of the states. Yeah, you might have some cities on there, might even throw some highways on there, but you don't have a lot of detail on that map. Small scale maps leave a lot of information out because it's looking at such a large area. The large scale map, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. The large scale map is large scale, large detail. Why? Because you're looking at such a small area. If you were to look at a map of Springfield, Springfield would be a large scale map because relative to a map of Virginia, relative to a map of the United States, it's looking at a very small area. So on a map of Springfield, you might see the high school, you might see the Whole Foods, you might see the Chipotle and McDonald's. But if you look at a map of Virginia, you're not going to see the Chipotle, you're not going to see the McDonald's, and you won't see West Springfield High School because they had to leave stuff out. Large scale, large detail, but a small area. Small scale, small detail, but of a larger area. So that's the idea of small scale, small detail, large scale, large detail. The last question on there as of now, and I invite you to still please do ask questions on there, is what is shifting cultivation? Shifting cultivation is a practice that is done in agriculture that you are moving the crops that you are growing. Usually you're rotating them over a certain period of time. So, for example, if you have field number 1 that's got your peas in it, field number 2 that's got your corn in it, and field number 3 that's got your clover in it, in year number 2, you're going to have your peas here, corn here, clover here. Year 3, peas here, corn here, clover here. And you rotate it through. So shifting cultivation takes up a lot of land because you're always rotating your crops through, sometimes leaving a field to fallow or rest. The problem with that is it's not very efficient because you don't necessarily use all those fields to grow. Another type of shifting cultivation could be slash and burn agriculture, where you are literally, this occurs in some lesser developed parts of the world with indigenous peoples, in which they take a portion of the forest, they literally slash it and burn it. Now, why they do that is because that's going to bring nutrients to that soil. The nutrients from the vegetation is going to be captured together in the soil, but it takes a while to do that because the field has to get that nutrients put back into it. So that does take a little bit of time to do. So that's a good question as well. All right, I believe that does it for the questions for right now. So please do continue to ask questions in there. See another question there. Question number 10 is, what are the different types of migration? So there are really kind of four different types of migration, if we want to look at it. There's really international migration and there's internal migration. So international migration is the migration of peoples from one country to another. Very rare in the grand scheme of things. Yes, the United States is a nation of immigrants. Yes, we have millions of people come to the United States. However, for the average everyday person, an international move is a big, big deal. That's extremely important to remember because it's not something everyone's going to be doing. Is the idea of international moves. If you do an international move, chances are you're going to a big city or kind of a area just outside of a city in a new country because that's where an economic opportunity is. That might be where there's a community of people that are like you that you're going to move to. But the idea of that, a random person from Germany moving to America in a random part of Nebraska, not all that common. You're not going to see that happen very often. If they do that move, it'll be a part of what's called step migration, which is they may go from the rural part of Germany to a urban part of Germany to an urban part of America to then a rural part of America. They might do this they might do this step migration. Chain migration is kind of related to that, and that is if you move to an area because there are people that are of your same cultural background. We talked about the area of Centerville in Fairfax County is a very large Korean population. That's a part of chain migration. You had a community of Korean immigrants that came over, kind of post World War II, post Korean War, and what they did is they set up this community there. And then as a result, lots of other people from Korea came to that area because they knew this was an area that had Korean peoples in it. It's an area that had Korean values in it in that regard. And so you're more likely to see that happen with chain migration. So that is something that happens as well. Far more common, though, is the internal migration, where you'll move within one country. Now, in the rest of the world, the most common internal migration is something called interregional migration, where you're moving from one region, in most parts of the world, it's rural, to another region, in most parts of the world, it's city, and you're undergoing this urbanization. That's a very common interregional move where you are moving from one region to another, usually because of economic opportunities, something along those lines. In the United States and in other parts of the world, the most popular interregional migration is suburbanization, moving from the cities to the suburbs or areas outside of those suburbs. You also have something called intra-regional migration. Intra-regional migration is when you're moving within the region. I use an example like this of Fairfax County and Montgomery County. If you and your family were to move from Montgomery County to Fairfax County, that's an intra-regional move. There's not really a lot of difference. You're moving from suburb to suburb. You're moving from a suburb of DC to another suburb of DC. That's not really an inter-region move, it's an intra-region move. You're moving within the region. However, if you were to move from Fairfax County down to Bristol, Tennessee, that would be an inter-regional movement because you're moving from a kind of a suburb to a more rural area. That would be an inter-regional move. So those are your several different types of migration patterns. Sean asks here in the chat, do we analyze a picture or chart for all the FRQs, or do we ever just pull from background knowledge? Good question, Sean. You'll see a mix of that on the AP exam. Typically, one question on the AP exam will have either one stimulus or two stimuli. Another might have one stimuli, whether it's a chart, whether it's a map, whether it's a graph. And there's usually always one question that has no stimuli whatsoever. So usually you see a country. Usually you'll see FRQ. Of the three FRQs you'll go through, one will definitely have a stimuli, maybe two. One will have a stimuli, a chart, a map, a graph, whatever. And then another stimuli, and another question will have no stimuli whatsoever. So a good question. You'll usually see a mix of those in that regards. All right, that takes care of the Google Doc questions that you have on there. Once again, if you do have additional questions, please continue with that. If you want to use the chat feature, you can go ahead and do that. We are at about the 46-minute mark as it stands right now. I certainly don't want to keep you on here for forever. But if people do have questions, I will answer them. But I certainly don't want to ramble here for a little bit. I will, in the interest, if any people are starting to type out some more questions, I will, in the interest of, you all, just remind you of a couple things. For your Unit 2, definitely hone in on the demographic transition model and population pyramids. There is always a lot of information that can be asked on the exam using a population pyramid, using a demographic transition model. So those are always good stimuli-based questions, either for multiple choice or for an FRQ. But that's the main idea of the migration and population unit of Unit 2 is the demographic transition model and population pyramids. And we already had a question about migration. For Unit 3, that's culture. There's a lot in that unit. I would hone in on that unit on the idea that we talked about, the cultural landscape. How can you see culture in the landscape? How can you see religion? How can you see language? How can you see ethnicity? How are those things visible in the landscape? That's a pretty big concept from that. In terms of religion, I would focus on how you see religion on the landscape, how religion has been impacted by geography, and how geography impacts religion. For language, I would look at the areas where imperialism and colonialization spread language to. Why do certain countries have certain linguistic patterns? I would take a look at that and dialects. I would also, for the culture unit, look at ethnicity. Look at areas that have that nation state concept, that idea of one group of people predominantly living in one area, right? That's that nation state concept. I'd compare that with the multi ethnic states that we talked about, where you have a lot of different ethnicities. For the political geography unit, I'd hone in on the boundaries, which we talked about. I'd also hone in on the idea of supranationalism and the idea of devolution. We talked about this in terms of the chart. Where are we going as a world? Are we going towards this supranationalism? Are we going towards this devolution? Are we going to a cooperative state? Are we all kind of fighting each other? How does this desire for a quest for the nation state come into play? That's something that you can look at as well. For agriculture, definitely von Thunen's model, right? Be looking at how does how does location impact where people, where food is grown, why food is grown in that area? Can we apply von Thunen today on a country or continental scale? That's something to look at. I'd also look at the idea of the different regions of subsistence and commercial agriculture. What's grown where would be a good thing to look at. I would also, moving on to Unit 6, that was the cities and urban land use. Definitely review those land use, those urban models that we talked about, the concentric zone model, the sector model, the multiple nuclei model, different world models like the Latin American city that kind of resembles the combo of the sector model and the concentric zone model, the African city model, the Southeast Asian city model, the Walter Kristallier's central place theory, goods and services. Why do certain areas have certain goods and services? That's an important question to be looking at. And then for the development in industry, Weber's least cost theory, the idea of where do you put manufacturing, where do you put these different groups, right? And development. How do you become more developed? How does your country become more developed? How do you go from a lesser developed country to a more developed country? How do you get there in that regards? Those are kind of the big topics from each one that I would go ahead and take a look at in that regards. All right. It does not seem as if any further questions came in the Google Doc. Neither on the chat. Oh, Grant's got one here on the chat. Is the practice exam on AP Classroom based on our final score, or is it more of a completion? More of a completion level there, Grant, to check in to see how you're doing. Not going to be a final score. Not going to scale it like, hey, if you got this many right, you'll get this, so on and so forth. Just more about a completion type of thing than anything else. All right. So, with that being said, that will, I think, do it for this year's huge huge review. So, I certainly hope that you all found this useful. As a reminder, this is on demand anytime for you to access, so you can watch it at your leisure. If you look at my channel, I believe I have some previous units on there, previous AP Human Geography review sessions on there as well. So, if you'd like to review that, you can review that as well. We will see you all tomorrow. A reminder to come in with 3 questions for tomorrow's class while we do some rapid fire Q&A, and we'll take a look at that as well. So until then, folks, we will say a good evening to you all and a good night, and we will see you tomorrow during class. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.